Charles, we're musicians. We were tearing up some hot swing music in the orchestra. Gail over there was swinging her fans.
Kept this to myself for 50 years. Charles Duke, 16's lunar module pilot and one of the youngest men to walk on the moon, breaks a silence that has haunted him since 1972. He says he saw something on the lunar surface that did not fit the mission plan, the geology maps, or the rulebook of human spaceflight. What did he witness? Why did he stay quiet? And is there footage to back it up? If you've ever wondered whether the moon still guards secrets, this is the confession you've been waiting for. The last great Highlands bet, when Apollo 16 was put on the schedule, NASA's planners knew the mission had to be different. The United States had already planted flags, collected samples, and proven humans could walk, work, and return safely from the moon. But Apollo 16 carried an extra weight. It was meant to reach deeper into the lunar story than any mission before it. Scientists argued that if they could get samples from the lunar highlands, they might finally crack the mystery of how the moon itself was formed. This wasn't about proving technology anymore. It was about chasing answers to questions as old as humanity. Where did the moon come from, and what role did it play in Earth's history? Up until that point, astronauts had landed in smoother, darker plains known as Maria. Those regions were easier to access and safer for landings, but they didn't represent the oldest rocks on the moon. The highlands, by contrast, were rugged and ancient. From telescopic studies and crater counts, geologists believed they were the oldest exposed surfaces, holding clues to the very beginning of the lunar crust. If the Maria were the moon's middle-aged skin, the highlands were its bones. The Decat's Highlands, the target for Apollo 16, had never been visited before. Scientists were divided over what exactly they would find. Some believed the terrain was volcanic. Others thought it was the wreckage of huge impacts that scarred the moon billions of years ago. Apollo 16 was the only chance to put those debates to rest. But betting on the highlands came with a price. The landing site was dangerous, filled with uneven ground, hidden slopes, and massive boulders. A safe descent was far from guaranteed. The lunar module had limited fuel for landing corrections, and any miscalculation could end the mission before it began. Engineers worried that the lander might sink into powdery dust or tip over on a hidden incline. Every detail had to be checked again and again. Even so, no simulation could capture the risks of a real descent into unfamiliar terrain. It was a gamble NASA chose to take, knowing that future missions might be cancelled. They had one shot to prove the risk was worth it. Charles Duke, the youngest astronaut to walk on the moon, felt that pressure firsthand. He knew that any mistake, whether in navigation, sample collection, or equipment use, could waste precious minutes, and those minutes mattered. Each moonwalk was a race against oxygen, battery power, and fatigue. Duke and mission commander John Young weren't just exploring, they were proving that humanity's push for knowledge could still justify the danger and expense of leaving Earth. Thought the site choice wasn't just scientific daring, it set the scene for one moment no checklist could predict. A tightrope crew. The story of Apollo 16 was not just about landing on a dangerous site. It was also about the three men who shouldered that risk. John Young, Charles Duke, and Ken Mattingly were very different personalities, but together they formed one of the most carefully balanced teams in the Apollo program. Every astronaut brought a history of close calls, second chances, and lessons that made them uniquely suited for this mission. In many ways, Apollo 16 was a tightrope walk across space, and the crew itself was the balancing pole. At the top stood John Young, the mission commander. By 1972, Young was a legend within NASA. He had flown on Gemini 3, smuggled a corned beef sandwich into orbit as a joke, docked with another spacecraft on Gemini 10, and orbited the moon during Apollo 10. No one doubted his skill or composure. Young was quiet, almost reserved, but his calm approach to risk made him invaluable. If anyone could guide a lunar module down into the jagged Descartes Highlands, it was John Young. He was the steady hand on the controls, the man NASA trusted when there was no margin for error. Charles Duke, the lunar module pilot, could not have been more different. At 36, he was the youngest man to walk on the moon. His journey to Apollo 16 was marked by setbacks that would have crushed others. Assigned to the Apollo 13 backup crew, Duke had unknowingly contracted rubella from one of his children. His illness spread to Ken Mattingly, forcing NASA to pull Mattingly off Apollo 13 just days before launch. Duke carried the guilt of that episode, but it also gave him a second chance. By the time Apollo 16 came around, he was determined to prove himself not only as an astronaut, but as a professional who could deliver under the crushing expectations of NASA's most ambitious scientific mission yet. Then there was Ken Mattingly, the command module pilot. If anyone understood the sting of bad timing, it was him. He had trained for Apollo 13 only to be yanked at the last moment because of Duke's exposure. Jack Swigert took his place, and history remembers Swigert for helping bring Apollo 13 home after the explosion. For years, Mattingly lived with the knowledge that he had missed both disaster and glory. Apollo 16 was his redemption. His role was lonely. He would spend most of the mission orbiting the moon alone in the command module. But it was also vital. Without him, Young and Duke could never return safely. What made this crew remarkable was not just their experience, but their resilience. All three men had tasted failure or frustration in ways that could have ended their careers. Instead, each returned sharper and more determined. That sense of redemption bonded them together. Their training was grueling. Long days of geology trips, endless hours in simulators, and survival exercises that pushed them past exhaustion. Young demanded discipline. Duke added youthful energy. Mattingly supplied technical precision. Together, they struck a balance that worked. NASA needed that balance. The Apollo program was winding down, and public interest had cooled. The astronauts felt the weight of carrying a mission that might be one of the last. Every hour of data, every rock sample, every moment on the moon mattered. It wasn't just about personal pride, it was about proving Apollo still had scientific firepower. That exploration was worth the cost, and that the risks they were taking would pay off in knowledge. Skill and pressure sharpened the crew, but pressure also creates blind spots, and one of those would matter. Training for the unknown, for all the glory of stepping onto the moon. The road to Apollo 16 was built on sweat, repetition, and preparation for dangers that no human had faced before. Training was not glamorous, it was exhausting, relentless, and sometimes demoralizing. Yet without it, there was no way John Young, Charles Duke, and Ken Mattingly could survive, let alone make Apollo 16 one of the most ambitious missions in NASA's history. They were being asked to operate machines on alien ground, collect scientific samples under brutal conditions, and do it all while the clock of life support ticked away. Training had to make them ready for the unknown. Much of that preparation focused on disaster scenarios. NASA simulated everything that could go wrong. Engine misfires, rover breakdowns, communication blackouts, even medical emergencies like a ruptured suit or a sudden illness. The astronauts drilled responses until their reactions became instinct. In one exercise, Duke had to practice what he would do if Young collapsed during an EVA. Could he drag his commander back to the lunar module in reduced gravity while keeping himself upright in a stiff suit? In another, they rehearsed procedures for a rover that wouldn't start, forcing them to plan how much ground they could cover on foot before oxygen ran out. These what-if drills were grim, but they could mean the difference between life and death on the lunar surface. The lunar roving vehicle was at the center of much of this training. Unlike earlier Apollo crews, Young and Duke would not be confined to walking distance from the lunar module. The rover gave them the power to travel miles across the highlands. That freedom also brought new risks. Could they navigate back if the vehicle failed? Could they handle the sharp slopes and deep craters of the Descartes region? Engineers built mock lunar landscapes on Earth-dusty, rocky fields filled with obstacles to test the rover's handling. Duke and Young spent hours bouncing over simulated ridges, learning how to control the machine in a world where gravity pulled at only 1/6 of Earth's strength. The rover would extend their reach, but it could also strand them far from home if anything went wrong. Training didn't stop with vehicles. The suits themselves were another battlefield. They were marvels of engineering portable life support systems that kept astronauts alive against deadly temperatures, radiation, and vacuum. But they were also heavy, stiff, and awkward. Imagine trying to pick up a pebble while wearing a suit of armor, gloves that robbed you of dexterity, and a helmet that narrowed your vision. Duke and Young practiced endlessly in these suits, lifting tools, swinging hammers, and bagging rocks until the moves became muscle memory. They learned how to conserve energy, how to squat without toppling over, and how to adjust their balance in a world where a single stumble could send them crashing into sharp rocks. Geology became the unexpected heart of their preparation. NASA knew Apollo 16 had to bring home more than heroic photographs. It had to deliver science. Geologists drilled the astronauts in the art of seeing rocks, spotting which samples revealed ancient volcanic flows, which showed signs of impacts which might hold clues to the moon's beginnings. Field trips took them to craters in Arizona, lava flows in Hawaii, and even impact scars in Canada. There, Duke practiced describing formations in short bursts of radio chatter, just as he would have to do on the moon while panting inside his helmet. The goal was to transform them from pilots into scientists who could collect samples with purpose. All of this training, however, had one unspoken gap. They had prepared for dust, rocks, mechanical failures, and even death, but no one trained them for the possibility of seeing something that shouldn't be there. The universe is vast, and the moon, for all its barrenness, still holds mysteries beyond geology. When Charles Duke later admitted that he caught sight of something strange racing past the rover, it was a moment training had never covered. It was not in the manuals. It was not in the drills. It was an unknown they were never expected to face. They trained to manage every known risk, yet what Duke describes slips through the cracks between known and unexpected. Descent to Descartes. On April 20, 1972, the world held its breath as the Apollo 16 lunar module Orion, piloted by John Young and Charles Duke, broke free from the command module and began its descent. Their target, the Descartes Highlands, a place no human had ever touched. From orbit, the surface looked jagged, littered with craters and ridges. But what looked rough from above often turned treacherous up close. Every meter mattered. Too far left, too far right, too fast, too slow. Any mistake could spell disaster. The descent into Descartes was more than just a landing. It was a test of nerve, training, and trust. Young, a veteran of 3 flights, carried the burden of guiding the lunar module down. His eyes darted between the windows and the instrument panel, balancing human judgment with the computer's calculations. Duke, strapped in beside him, called out altitude and fuel numbers. Each passing second drained the module's limited reserves. They had only a razor-thin margin to find a stable patch of ground. Below, the highlands looked worse than anyone had predicted. Scattered boulders, rolling slopes, and shadows that threatened to conceal deadly craters. At one point, Mission Control worried aloud that they might have to abort. Yet Young kept his cool, easing Orion toward a spot just flat enough to risk it. With a final puff of thrusters, the lunar module settled onto the surface. "Houston, the Falcon is on the plane at Descartes," Young announced, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through him. The landing site itself was unlike the familiar Maria of earlier missions. Instead of smooth basalt plains, the highlands were rugged, ancient, and unpredictable. Dust swirled under their descent engines, revealing sharp rocks that looked out of place. For Duke, gazing out of the small window, the moment was overwhelming. It hit Mime on the moon. "I'm really here," he later recalled. Beneath the ore, though, was the constant hum of pressure. Every step outside would have to be careful. Every sample they picked up had to count. When Duke and Young stepped onto the lunar surface, their first tasks were functional. They unloaded equipment, erected the American flag, and deployed the ALSEP Apollo Lunar Surface Experiments package, a set of instruments designed to collect seismic, atmospheric, and radiation data. Time was their enemy. The suit's limited mobility, the oxygen clock ticked down, and fatigue built with every movement. Yet their checklists stretched on for hours. The men bent, hammered, drilled, and photographed with a rhythm drilled into them during training. They had no time for mistakes. Then came the moment that transformed Apollo 16 into something more than just another lunar landing. The rover's first outing. For the first time in history, a crew could drive across the moon. Duke took the wheel, and suddenly, the horizon expanded. No longer confined to a circle around their landing site, they could push out miles into the highlands. The ride was rougher than expected. The rover bounced and skidded across slopes, throwing up clouds of fine gray dust. But it worked, and it opened the mission to new possibilities. They drove to craters, boulders, and ridges, each stop adding to their sample bags and their growing collection of data. The exhilaration of the drives mixed with the strangeness of their Unlike the relatively flat plains of previous Apollo sites, the Descartes region felt alive in its ruggedness. The jagged hills seemed to shift with the light, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the silence pressed in with an eerie weight. Duke later said he felt both wonder and the sense of being somewhere profoundly foreign, somewhere that had kept its secrets for billions of years. At that moment, the mission was going exactly as planned. They were landing samples, setting up instruments, and driving farther than anyone had before. Yet hidden within those routines was the stage for something no checklist anticipated. On one of those long drives, while the cameras rolled and the rover kicked up dust, Charles Duke would notice something flicker past the moment he dismissed at the time, but one that would haunt him for the rest of his life. With the rover rolling and cameras running, the mission's best tool turns into the stage for Duke's strangest memory. The blink you can't unsee. Charles Duke had dreamed of the moon since childhood, but no dream could have prepared him for the weight of silence on the Descartes Highlands. Out there, away from Earth, every sound was muffled into radio chatter and the hiss of his suit's life support system. The horizon stretched grey and endless. The rover crunched softly across powder that hadn't been touched in billions of years. It was in this alien stillness, when routine should have ruled the day, that Duke claims something unexpected jolted him out of rhythm, a fleeting, impossible sight. It happened during one of the rover traverses. As Young navigated and Duke handled tools and observations, the rover had stopped, dust still settling, when a shadow darted across the corner of Duke's visor. At first, he thought it was a reflection, maybe the rover's antenna catching the sun or dust stirred up by their tires. But this movement was too quick, too deliberate. A dark shape, low to the ground, moved fast across the ridgeline and vanished. The whole event lasted no more than a second. It was the blink of an eye, something so quick the brain barely had time to register. Yet the image seared into Duke's memory. His instincts told him to dismiss it. Training had drilled discipline into him. Focus on geology, keep to the checklist, don't waste time on distractions. On the moon, time wasn't just money, it was oxygen, it was life. So he said nothing. He knelt down, scooped samples, described rocks into the recorder. John Young never knew what his partner had just seen. Mission Control never heard a word. The shadow became Duke's private burden. Inside the lunar module that night, he replayed the moment. Could it have been his visor fogging or a trick of peripheral vision? Could his mind, stressed by fatigue, have invented motion where there was none? Astronauts are trained to analyze, to reduce the unexplained to mechanical causes, but no matter how many rational boxes he ticked, the memory refused to vanish. The image of that darting form lingered like an itch he couldn't scratch. Back on Earth, the silence continued. Duke was still young, still building his career, still tied to NASA's culture of precision and certainty. Astronauts didn't talk about shadows. They talked about geology, engines, and experiments. Besides, he had no evidence, just a second-long glimpse. He buried the memory, telling himself it wasn't important, and for decades, he kept it that way. But the human mind is rarely satisfied with loose ends. Over the years, the sight returned to him in quiet moments, often when he was alone. It wasn't fear that gripped him so much as unease, the sense that the universe had flashed him a secret, and he had looked away. He began to wonder whether the rover's cameras had caught the same scene. The Apollo missions had recorded hours of footage. Somewhere in those frames might lie confirmation, or at least reassurance that his mind hadn't played tricks. When Duke finally revisited the footage years later, the chill of recognition struck him. In the grainy video, a dark shape moved across the surface just as he remembered, fast, deliberate, impossible to categorize. It was larger than he had thought, almost rivaling the rover in size. Seeing it again didn't give him closure. Instead, it raised new questions.